Welcome all of you to this fifth plenary session of the Economics of Happiness Conference. The title of this session is Envisaging the Future. What would a localised world look like? And for me, it's a key question because it undertakes that difficult leap from idea to execution, from theory to practice. It's very easy, I think, sometimes in groups of like-minded people to sit and talk about what you like and what you don't like. I'd like some lights. But the more challenging thing, I think, is, okay, what would this actually mean on the ground? What would a localised economy actually do? How would it work? How would people like us in an affluent first world country deal with it? What does it mean for internationalism? What does it mean for solidarity? And what does it mean for all sorts of other questions concerning the qualities of people's lives? That practical emphasis is sometimes what I find lacking in discussion. I can acknowledge people have great ideas, but when I ask them, okay, what can I do? What will it be like? And how will it work? Sometimes the silence is overwhelming. I don't think the silence is going to be overwhelming today. Let me first introduce people I gather many of you already know well. Obviously, sitting here, if we go from my left, Helena Norberg-Hodge, Adebayo Clement Akomolafe, Manish Jain, and Michael Shuman. I'm going to ask our speakers, beginning with Michael, if you would, succinctly, what do you bring to this topic? When we see that topic, envisaging the future, what would a localised world look like? What's your take on it?
Well, my take is that I work with a lot of communities, mostly in the United States, but sometimes outside the United States, and take on very specific localization challenges. So just to give some examples over the last year, I've worked in North Carolina over the question of whether a set of dams owned by Alcoa should be moved to public ownership because it's effectively a way of relocalizing energy and prove that the state could generate about $1 billion of additional wealth and prosperity over the lifetime of the dams if they did so. And I did another study in Ohio dealing with local food and showed that a 25% shift toward food localization would create 27,000 new jobs, enough to reemploy 1 out of 6 unemployed people in the Cleveland region. So I see localization as a wealth-building, very practical economic development strategy. In fact, the only economic development strategy that works. And so I hope I can bring to this discussion more specific examples like that.
Great. Manish?
I think that when we talk about localization in the economy, one of the things we need to talk very deeply about is our understanding of knowledge. How we create it, how we share it, how we deconstruct it, how we reconstruct it. And along with knowledge, how is it connected to our everyday lives? How it's connected to our communities? How it's connected to our deepest passions? How it's connected to our ecosystems? So that kind of vision of localization is something that I really want to explore more, because unless we look at knowledge in a very different way, and how do we create space for all diversity of knowledges? We're living in an illusion that what happens in schools and universities is knowledge, and what happens is life is something else. So how do we move beyond what we have? And how do we then redesign all of our spaces? Our entire world has been, every aspect of our life has been disciplined and designed according to a certain industrial view of the mind and the world. And so how do we, starting with this room, how would we design it, I think, in a way that, and who else would be in this room with us are some of the questions we should be asking.
Thank you, Manish. Manish was also the person who brought us all from behind the desk, by the way. We were all going to be behind that barrier. And I voted against it. Bio.
Thank you. My father used to tell me a story about how things were before I was born. In those days, it's always those days. In those days, he said, we used to sell things by leaving them out of our houses. We just placed our items and then we left. We could, laziness was not such a tense word then. We left and just went to play. And people who needed to buy stuff would just come and drop what they have and take and go. It's impossible now to think of that. We trade and we have barbed wires and we have security fences and we have guns and all that. So I think my take on it is localization is really about a reclamation of the spaces between us. The stories that once binded us together and brought us together. The spaces between us right now are so tense. I mean, on the taxi coming towards to the airport on my way to Australia, I remember I was put in a taxi by the university, and I felt this urge to just say hello to him, or else I wouldn't have, got to know his name or that. His job is to drive me, my job is to pay him, and that's all. But I felt this urge to reach out to him and say, hello, what's your name? And we actually engage in a conversation. Right now, we need a conversation starter. We need to re-enchant the spaces between us. We need to tell the stories that once bound, united us again. That's what localization means to me. Yeah.
Thank you. Helena.
And for me, localization means living in what I've often talked about, writing a song that's called I'm Dreaming of a Walking Distance Future. Because what I experienced in Ladakh, and to a great extent in rural Spain, where we lived for a long time, was still structures that were decentralized enough so that I could walk to everything I needed. And that wasn't just to the shops, it was to the theater, it was to the music, it was to the politics, and that allowed then for that walking, size, that scale, that human scale, which was also at a human pace. Our interactions in those structures allowed us the time that Cable was also talking about, how localizing and slowing down go together. I tasted that enough to be convinced that I was infinitely happier that way. And the evidence is so clear, as far as I'm concerned, because in those very same places, as things have speeded up, and there's the car going faster and faster, and the economic pressures pulling people into the city, the statistics are very clear. The epidemic of depression, of stress-related illness, and so on is there. So I do believe that we have evolved for most of our time in history, almost, this little blip, let's remember that. So I think it's very helpful to realize that what we often think of in the West as just, well, this is the reality, this is the way things are, is actually a tiny, tiny blip in our evolution. Our whole makeup, our bodies, as Huang was saying, are made for that slower, more localized, more interdependent life.
Thank you, Helena. I'll start with Michael, if I may, but it's a general question I'd like to ask. Is this whole notion, and I acknowledge what Bayo just said about sometimes we're trapped into the patterns of thought that have come along. And one of mine is the old left-right divide. And I grew up on the left of the left-right divide. And issues like choice as opposed to necessity have always been very important to me. What's the difference if someone is middle class and has lots of choices and can make decisions about their personal engagement with the economy based on I choose this, I don't choose that? And they can opt for localization, they can opt for few travel miles for food, for any sort of economic production. What about the working class person or the unemployed person who lives by necessity? They don't have choices governing their economic life. They do what they have to do and what they must do. How does that reality fit into localization?
Well, the way that you formulated the question, you imply that the better, cheaper, more cost-effective choices that a low-income person faces are not to buy local or not to invest local. And that is, I would just dispute the premise. In the United States, there's long been a belief that poor people lack either the consciousness or the income to buy what was perceived to be more expensive local food. What was not appreciated is that most low-income Americans live in food deserts, and the food that they face for purchase is at corner store bodegas, or they have to drive very long distances, and the food tends to be highly processed and in the end very expensive. So in fact, farmers markets, which often do have slightly more expensive food than mainstream grocery stores, nevertheless are more cost effective than the corner stores that people face in either inner city communities or in rural areas. And I'll give you one specific example. In Portland, Oregon, several years back, a regional chain called New Seasons, which focuses on fresh local food, they had a big question about whether they were going to build a new store in what was the lowest income zip code of Portland. And they decided to do that, and it is now their most successful store. And what it shows is that even people with low income know the difference between price and value.
Okay. The questions are open to everyone to ask, and then we'll obviously go to audience questions soon. But if anyone else has anything they'd like to say on any question, please don't wait for me to ask you. Just leap in.
I would just say again, the question that we've for my own process of unlearning of how I saw the poor, spending a lot of time with people in villagers in India and also in urban slums, that I find that actually if I see again the globalization model makes everyone feel like they're in deficit, and we look at people, communities, particularly through the development lenses, always as these people are in deficit. And I've actually found that from the perspective of knowledge, practical knowledge, poor people are much more skilled in every aspect, how to build your houses, or how to fix things, or how to grow things. And so that is an aspect that goes unaccounted for in our measurements that we're looking at. Or there's much more sharing that's happening of resources again, and that again does not get calculated in the ways we look at GDP and things like that. So there's a lot of richness there that is actually there, and I find that if we really want to look at localization and understand it deeply, there's a lot to learn from those so-called poor people, which we need to bring into our conversations, and rather than seeing them always from that deficit victim perspective.
Right. Just on that, the reality of the so-called green revolution, Manish, where through, and I acknowledge this completely up front, that corporate techniques of mass farming, of monocultural farming, of the application of fertilisers massively improve yields through, say, the 50s and 60s and 70s, putting to one side the considerable side issues with that. In terms of that capacity to grow food, say if we take the example of a Kenyan farmer who wants to be able to grow a crop that he knows or she knows they can sell into the European market, is that not a good thing that suddenly that person can grow a monoculture of beans but can sell them in large amounts to a profitable first world market as opposed to focusing on the much lower income base of their own community? Does the question make sense to you? Yeah. Okay.
Why don't you start out?
Well, So I think it's a huge mistake to believe that the best development strategy that faces someone in the global south is to be in an unequal and yet still paying relationship with a community in the north. Because at the end of the day, Any community is going to be wealthier if it is as self-reliant as possible and then enters the global economy to the extent it cannot provide for its own needs from a position of strength. And this is especially true in basic human needs: food, water, medicine, housing. These are things that we know how to do self-reliance in a cost-effective way. You can't do every foodstuff locally, but you can do most foodstuffs locally. And if we just build that level of self-reliance worldwide, that's when we can then invite other communities to just trade with us in a very small number of goods and services that they cannot produce for themselves.
Okay. Yep, no, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, partly to the earlier question. By the way, I also want to let you know, audience, we had no idea about what questions he was going to pop us. So we're quite brave to do this. It's a bit of an experimental thing.
For all of us.
Yeah, for all of us. Yeah. But I just wanted to add, when you were talking at first about poor people not being able to buy the products, that one of the things that we keep stressing is that we must expose the fact that we're paying for our food and our housing and our shelter out of two pockets. Our tax pocket, where we put a lot of money into the center, and our private pockets. The tax pocket is being used to subsidize old processed food from far away, and making that cheaper than local food. And it's not just old processed stuff that ends up cheaper, but even a so-called fresh apple from 10,000 miles away will almost without exception cost less, very often half as much as a local apple. And when I say local, I also just want to stress that we're talking about a shortening of distances. There's no absolute here. We're talking about common sense, and what we're promoting is this direction of shifting. Local doesn't have a defined limit. But then, in addition, this idea that people on the other side of the world that have the poverty that exists in the so-called third world has grown out of colonialism, previously slavery, colonialism, debt enslavement. So over there you've got some people who are not doing so well, and over in the industrialized world you have people who have been monetized, handed lots of money from those banks that benefit from getting them indebted and having a lot of money in their pocket. And then, so you have this completely unequal playing field. It's the middlemen, the giant corporations that benefit by those long distances. Cheap labor over here, people with money over here. So when we think we can do fair trade and really a good project for creating wealth in the South, we really have to understand that working across that very corrupt and very, very destructive divide doesn't make sense. It makes much more sense to help to rebuild local economies there. I hope that makes sense. And shifting the subsidies and taxes here and there, liberating ourselves from those banks, as Jimmy was saying yesterday, it could lead to very, very rapid transition, but that's only going to happen if we, the so-called choir, that I don't think is yet a choir, but if we, the choir, link up across our social, personal, environmental divides and put in front of the noses of our so-called representatives, our political representatives, you're either going to support people on the planet or you're out. We cannot have you supporting the banks and corporations anymore.
Now, Manish, I wondered whether you had a long enough time to digest my convoluted question to have an answer. If not, we can move on. I've got another convoluted one to ask you.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that
in a minute, yep.
It's just maybe the reference points we're using are so different that it's really difficult because I've seen how, and other friends like Devenderji would, the green revolution, the ecological crisis is there. But the question of what people are eating is really radical. Like, I've spent so many time in indigenous communities. The number of grains that they were eating is just mind-boggling. Now they're reduced to, because they've gone for those that have gone for the cash crop globalized model, they eat cheap subsidized white flour. which is one of the worst, most unhealthy things that we're learning on the planet. And so we think that that growth model has actually given them better. But if you actually go, and then there's other friends here like our Korean friend, you know, that all the different kinds of green, wild things that people had access to, again, have disappeared. And you find that most communities who are going for that cash crop model, they don't have enough green fruits or vegetables or anything in their diets anymore. So, and then we go in terms of their social relationships. Wherever, again, cash crops have grown, you find lots of weakening social bonds. So what has increased, yes, is the number of consumer goods in their hands. But I think the question we're trying to ask is, what are all of those other things? You know, the ecological part of the green revolution and its damage has come out, but what has it actually done? That story has not yet been fully told.
Thank you, great.
It's a question to all of you. What my question is as a person living in this culture, what can I do, very practical, what can I do on an economic level to help promote this change, apart from putting my money into a credit union? What else can I do?
I would say set out a really modest goal. Set out a 5% change in your purchasing pattern each year. You know, and a 5% change in your banking pattern, in your mortgage pattern, and a 5% change in your superannuation fund. And you know, I think figuring out how to do this is an enormous step forward. You know, one thing we didn't talk about really yesterday in the discussions that we had about local investment is that at the end of the day, the best way to invest in your economy is to invest in yourself. Get off of credit cards, get off of, you know, if you can own your house or your unit of housing, if you can pay down your mortgage faster, if you think about, rather than throwing money into some other long-distance investment, invest in a garden, invest in a greenhouse, invest in energy efficiency in your house. There's a lot of things that you can do that have much better payoffs than you are going to get on Wall Street and the equivalent in Australia.
I have to use the microphone. I have a feminine voice. I think Michael has done a great job in establishing exactly how you could, on personal level, on an economic level, things you could do to, you know, make the changes that you would like to see. But on a personal, maybe should I call it, at the risk of sounding conventional, psychological level, I would say that for me, it's all about regaining and finding again your vulnerability. I think what connects us to each other is the idea that we need each other. We need each other at this time more than ever before. And what builds community is the idea, is the fact that I'm not complete. I need you to survive. I need you to be who I am. And so we need to reclaim that story much more than the practices and the technological aspects of coming together. We need to regain that story that I do really need you to survive. Most of the problems that are around the world right now have to do with the fact that I'm independent. I can do without you. All I need to do is just go chase this program of social ascension and everything is all right with me. But basically, that's a fallacy. That's an illusion that we need to step out of. I need you as much as you need me. And from there, from that story onward, things start to get better, I think.
We live in an outrageously overdeveloped country. We only spend a minute proportion of our income on food, and we're talking about localization of food, where we spend about 10 or 15% of what we spend on food. And we have our cars, we drive all over the place, we use oil from international companies, petrol from international companies, we fly all over the world, we have our iPads and our iPhones. We are grossly overdeveloped, while hundreds and hundreds of millions of people live on $1 a day in Africa, in South America, in India. So have we got it all wrong? We are the ones who have to reduce our standard of living enormously so that others may just live. I just think it's so outrageous that we're overspending and we have the expectation we can't live on $1,000 a week in Australia. Get real. These people live on $6, $7, $8, $10 a week. So we have to look at the whole aspect of being fair to the 90% of the world who are living way under our standard of living. I think we're just going crazy with our standard of living and our expectations.
One little thing on that. Just to open our imagination, could we imagine a world where everyone could live on less than $1 a day? Less. Less than $1. Can you imagine that kind of world?
But I think also it's incredibly important here. You see, this I think was part also when you were talking about the poor here in Australia and the poor in America. Within the industrialized world, we have been urbanized and pulled away from the land, the water, the resources that could feed us, that could provide our clothing and our building materials. So in that urban poverty, it's almost impossible to survive without money. But what we're talking a lot about, and especially Manish, when he talks about the poor in India, he's talking about people who are still on the land. This is an incredibly important issue, because if we don't distinguish, we don't understand that there are a lot of people who can live like kings on $1 a day. I mean, in places like Ladakh and Bhutan and many parts of India, they are far better off than many people here who are earning $100 a day. And we really, our economic illiteracy, you know, in terms of understanding this system and how it operates, prevents us from seeing that, and therefore, often through our goodwill and our desire to help them, you know, with the project of fair trade and how can we bring more money to them, we actually pull them into dependence. That's partly what Vandana was talking about, that even many of the microcredit schemes have done that. They've pulled people into becoming consumer culture members, and it's been, you know, people would describe it as the creeping arms of capitalism, pulling people in, you know, through small debt, but nevertheless debt, to people who were not in debt before, who had some animals, who had some land, and were relatively self-sufficient, and most of them were not living like kings. I'm not saying that, but there are people who are living really well on $1 a day still. The number is going down very rapidly because of the development paradigm, because of the enormous amount of goodwill. A lot of people are doing this through total heartfelt goodwill, and they don't realize they're actually helping. Through commercializing and creating dependence on the global market, they're making them more vulnerable and more dependent.
Now I realise thank you, Helena. I realise that there are people waiting, but I want to launch into another ignorant question. The critique that is made of sometimes when this discussion comes up is that people advocating localisation are somehow wanting people in both the developed world but also in the developing world to stay at a pre-industrial level of activity. That what the call is for is, and on the same hand there are people desperate to be connected, that one of the virtues to many people of the 21st century is global interconnectivity. You can communicate and get messages to and from everyone in the world. So there's this, for me, in my ignorance, there is this seemingly difficult irreconcilability. On the one hand, there is great virtue in a pre-industrial life with its diversity of foodstuff, with its social connections, with its rootedness in family and culture and place. On the other hand, people don't want to be left behind in some pre-industrial backwater. Is that a contradiction that you think is not valid? And I'm very happy to hear that it isn't, or what do you make of that contradiction?
If I could take that first. Your ignorant questions are really scary. I mean, I wonder if what a wise question would look like. The assumption behind the question you've just raised is, I believe that society, life is on a linearity, so to speak, on a straight line. And we can trace pre-industrial, industrial in that manner. So basically we're progressing. You know, there's this logic of progress that seems to ooze out from what you're trying to say. And it's one that I refute and I disagree with. I do not believe that societies can be placed on a linear scale and can be measured according to that linear scale. You spoke about communication. I do not believe that we're getting closer, or the internet or BlackBerries are bringing us closer. I mean, have you walked into a family in Africa and actually seen brothers and sisters communicating with each other in the same room but communicating through the BlackBerry? I mean, that's how bad we now think of communication. Are we actually getting closer in a globalized world? I would say no. I would say we're getting isolated and we're needing each other much more and more. And out of that frantic space of fear and anxiety and isolation, we're reaching out with beautiful new technology, beautiful in quote, that, I don't know if you've heard of the new iPad. I think it has a new USB port, and that's the innovation behind it. Or, and iPad 3, oh, look, I can now connect with you and see you in color. And basically, that's what, it seems we're frantically searching for how to connect with each other again. We do not know how to say hello again, so to speak. We've lost the beauty of hugging each other. We've lost. So it's the logic of progress that I think we have to refute. Some people would use the language of going back, you know, we're going back to the pre-industrial age. It's not a going back. And it's not really, I don't want to romanticize the indigenous by saying it's all well and good with how it was and stuff like that. It's not about going back. It's about marching on with re-evaluating the stories that shape our lives, basically. Let me
just
pass the mic quick.
Okay, just as a quick counterpoint, though, you know, there is now the capacity using the internet and using digital communication to do, say, as an example, remote surgery. So someone living in a remote community who needs surgery can now achieve that with a doctor, and she or he may be literally thousands of miles away. I'm just wanting to be a counterpoint here. Surely there is in the technology that we now have significant progress in human health, in productivity in different scales, and I realise these are all arguable, but it comes back, how do we reconcile the desire for information transfer with the desire for closeness, community, and authentic communication?
I think it's about having a heightened sensitivity to how these technologies actually play out with other systems that are colluding in shaping who we are as people. What I mean to say is this. This response is from the fringes, but in West African spirituality, there are spiritual, or shall I call it psychedelic technologies that allow people to communicate without the use of the internet over far distances. So it's like, it's treating the internet and all these information technologies as if they are the only way to communicate. You may not believe that, and I know it may sound incredulous to you, but the situation really is we cannot continue to treat these technologies as if they're the only way, they're the only way, they're the only solution, basically. Yeah.
What I'm seeing as a general trend is that those technologies are destroying and displacing the other technologies, including more human-scale technologies, and we're seeing a situation where medicine is becoming more and more expensive for the average person. Even in Sweden, you know, these high-tech approaches reduce the number of players. You have to go into the capital, the very best hospital, and it costs, often people are going into debt for a lifetime. That's certainly what's happening in New Delhi now as they go for the modern surgery and the modern medicine. We have to understand it's linked to the profit-making corporate side of things.
Okay. There are other questions, but yep, Manish?
Also, I think the localization movement is always pushing us to ask, what are the real costs behind that?
Okay.
So that's the thing. You know that there's one life which is very precious and valuable, but what is the entire structure that has to be created for that? How many other people's lives are being affected by the mining that's required for that structure, by the pollution that's being created out of that structure, by the hierarchies that are being created out, by the corporations that are created out of the structures? I think that's what we also have to That's the black box that the localization movement is opening up. That's been hidden from us for the last 100 years. We need to open that now.
Yep. Please.
I'd just like to read out a question by my friend who follows the discussion somewhere upstairs. So let's take the position that this future we have envisaged for Australia and the world is possible and is coming. What steps do we need to take to ensure that the farming communities that are today subsidised by our taxes and supplying to, and supplying to Woolworths are tomorrow still supported and included in the vision we have for a new localised world?
In that communication, was it directed to a particular person or is it for the panel?
I don't think so.
Okay. Please.
Well, I think if you, I know it was hard to hear all of Bill McKibben's talk, but there was one riff where he talked about a very hopeful statistic in the United States that farmers are making a comeback. It's not huge, but we've bottomed out on the curve. And now farming and the people who want to get into farming are increasing. And I think that can be a cornerstone for how we rebuild the food system. You know, and I want to add something that integrates on the previous conversation, and that is, to me, there's a fundamental principle of sustainability that ought to guide localization. So a lot of us are familiar with the Brundtland Commission formulation that sustainability is meeting the needs of the current generation without sacrificing the needs of future generations. And the problem I have with that definition is that it lacks any awareness of place or the inequities that occur that Manish was talking about, as one place profits at the expense of another. So I think another formulation might be, how can we meet all of the needs of the people of our community, present and future, without in any way impairing the ability of other communities to meet their needs, present and future? And with that formulation, I think one of the first places where we start to model sustainability and wealth building is in food and farming. And bringing the food system, bringing self-reliance in the food system, I think all of us understand at a visceral level that if you get food right, many of the other things fall into place.
Many might have heard me say this many times, but I also have found that in working on promoting a new economic paradigm, that it's been rather difficult to get most economists interested in rethinking food and seeing it as the center of the economy, that the rest of the economy needs to be structured around it. Michael and Manish and some of the other economists here, Jimmy, Charles, are all exceptions to that. But we all know that the only thing that human beings produce, that every human being on the planet needs every single day, is food. It's the only thing we produce that we absolutely have to have every day. We don't produce the water, which is even more important. And just think about it when we have disruptions now in weather or with financial crises. You know, the thing that will happen and has happened in some communities is with those disruptions, the supermarkets are empty in about 3 days. So rebuilding that diversified, rich, and incredibly spiritually and psychologically joyful center of our communities and our lives, rebuilding the food economy is, the most important economic transition. And we have seen that when that really starts moving, the other things start following.
Actually, if I can add one other thing, which is, and this is a little bit of economic speak, but one of the reasons why local food is spreading, not just in the industrialized north, but really throughout the world, is that food distribution systems, the global food distribution system, is incredibly inefficient. And as oil prices rise, it's going to become even more inefficient. Give you some numbers from the United States. When you bought $1 of foodstuff in the year 1900, basically 20 cents went to the farmer and the rest went to inputs and distribution. Today, it's 7 cents that goes to the farmer and 71 cents for distribution. And distribution includes transportation, packaging, refrigeration, retail markup, insurance, things that have nothing to do with food. Whenever you get to a situation where the distribution costs are very large and production costs are very small, it makes sense to localize. Because even really expensive food production, instead of 7 cents for the farmer, 14 cents, if you can get rid of most of that 71 cents of global garbage that we call distribution costs, you can have cheaper food and more income for farmers.
I totally agree with putting food at the center. And I would just like to point out how our entire educational system is totally disconnected from that. There is nothing. The majority of people, lots of young people I meet in India, very talented, very highly schooled. I ask you, do you know how to cook? I said, I can make a piece of toast. And very proudly, like, you spent the last 22 years of your life and you don't know how to even cook well or create something beautiful. You don't know anything about how to grow food. You don't know how to serve food. You don't know how to compost food. The disconnect is so stark, it's scary. And that we're creating a whole class of parasites, educational parasites, who are disconnected from this. I just wanted to point that really, if we had to redesign education, the starting point is food. And our people are not, this has been for thousands of years. Food has been the center of community. So I think that and it's the center of learning. So that's what I would just like to share.
I've been enjoying discussion about food, but I'd like to broaden the discussion about local and broaden it. My question is to Michael. I speak to people about what about everything else that we need? Clothes, kitchenware, arts and crafts, but particularly clothes, say, that locally you go into the shops, nothing's in Australia, made in Australia any longer. So without bringing tariffs in again, which is not going to happen, I don't think, how do you envisage and see the possibility of us making all the other things that we need locally?
Okay, great question. And there's a lot of, I think, really interesting trends that we can look at that should give us optimism that probably 80 or 90% of what the industrialized North spends its money on can be cost effectively localized. First point to make, for households across the OECD countries, about 2/3 of the money that they spend is on services. Services used to be 1/3 of our expenditures back in 1960. Now it's 2/3 of our expenditures. The thing about services is that they are inherently local. Now, I acknowledge that there is going to be the occasional surgery that occurs over the internet. Most of us want our surgeons local.
But not all of us have that choice.
Not all of us have that choice, that's right. But you know, when I got off the plane last Tuesday and I looked like a pretzel, I got a massage, all right? Now, I don't know how I'm going to get my massage over the internet. Some of you have some ideas, I'm sure. Then so let's talk about the other third, which is goods. When you look at the goods that we purchase, 3/4 of the goods we purchase are so-called non-durable goods, goods we consume regularly. So food falls in this category, paper. Clothing is kind of borderline durable, non-durable. I guess increasingly it's non-durable the way that it's manufactured. But the interesting thing about most non-durable goods is that they weigh a lot and their dollar value per unit weight is small. And what that means is that when oil prices rise, these are the first things we're going to be localizing. In fact, you can argue that this is one of the reasons why we're having food localization right now. It's not going to, yeah, we still may be importing wines from around the world, and we still may be importing spices, but most foodstuffs, it's not going to be cost effective to import long distances unless we continue to subsidize oil and banking and transportation. And that's why the next time there's a GFC and a bunch of big banks are ready to go out of business, we have to have the courage to accept the verdict of the marketplace that global is no longer cost effective.
Okay. How can we consider localization truly on the cultural side? How can we go back to a, say, around here, a Bar and Shire-minded community, which we have, but we have because we have people coming from Bhutan. We have it because we have people, going all over the world to get ideas. How can we do it without returning to sort of medieval, I'm scared of my neighbors, they live in Lismore type mentality? How can we do it while staying global? Because that is maybe arguably the greatest benefit of, capitalism in global society, was that we were able to have people, to have friends in South Korea, to have people and ideas come from all over the world, and to eat things from all over the world. 95% of the things you found even at the farmers' markets don't come from here. Zucchinis never existed in Australia. Look at the name, zucchini. It doesn't even make sense. It's one of the greatest things we have, was to be global, and maybe the greatest benefit of capitalism was to bring that. How can we keep that global with being truly local without having to be, yes, I'll do my garden, but I'll take a flight to Spain next week?
Good question. Thank you. Thank you.
I actually think that's a difficult question to ask, and the answers are not going to be absolute. It's just an experiment, basically. But I think most people have the idea that localization means some kind of isolation, that it means a regionalism, that we're cut off from everyone else. I do not think that that's implied in going local. And you said something about how do we reclaim our culture? How do we reclaim culture, basically? How do we hold on to culture and at the same time connect with others who are different from us? Basically, when most people think of culture, they think of a frozen kind of practice. Like most people, when they think of Yoruba people, I don't know how many people know about Yoruba people in the house over here. But if anyone does, most people would think of our flamboyant dresses, the rituals that we practice, the colors we paint on our faces, the tribal marks we tell stories with. But those things in themselves are not what makes us Yoruba. It's the conversations we have. So a reclamation of culture is a reclamation of the conversational spaces that bind us together. That is, I think, at the heart of going local. And I do not think that it implies going back to some kind of medieval kind of era. Also, I think, am I doing good? Like I said, I'm not dealing with an exact science. Thank you. It's not an exact science to be able to answer such questions. It's really difficult to kind of even contain it in one's mind. The question rather is, how do we maintain both strands, global and local? And I believe on the local end, it means us coming together and concretizing practices that bind us together. It could mean a ritual. It could mean some kind of food network. It could mean anything, but it just means us interacting with each other. How do we maintain the global aspect as well? It also means that we have to open up spaces for learning and continuing to learn from other people. Now, how that is going to happen, I cannot tell, but I know that we cannot continue to see culture as a closed boundary. We see it as an open space for conversation with other people. Hope I did good.
Can I just come in quickly?
Yes.
One of the things in my life that I'm very happy that I did. As a young man, I went to Nicaragua in the immediate aftermath of the Nicaraguan Revolution, and I specifically went there not to carry a gun, I went there to pick coffee. And I picked coffee for 3 months in Nicaragua as part of an international solidarity effort, non-violent activism to help the economic basis of that new country. For many, many years, I would hunt down Nicaraguan coffee. Okay, I wanted to keep buying Nicaraguan coffee. It meant a lot to me personally and politically. What I want to, and I want to follow the young man's question, is that one of the things that concerns me about localization, does it mean in practice a diminution of solidarity? Is it better for me to be going out and buying Byron Bay coffee, which is also good coffee, or should I be hunting down that Honduran, El Salvadoran, Central American coffee because those people have a huge economic challenge?
Is it, you wanna, okay, is it better, that's a deep question, is it better to want to engage in your immediate community, or is it better to want to
act in solidarity?
Act in solidarity with other spaces out there. I think that, difficult question, sorry. Okay, let Helena try.
Sure.
Let me muse on this. Let me chew this for a little while.
Okay.
I mean, from my point of view, it isn't such a difficult question because I'm looking at this economic globalization needing to shift towards economic localization. And as far as I'm concerned, that has absolutely nothing to do with isolation or a reduction in collaboration, international exchange, support, nothing. In fact, what I've experienced is that when people feel secure, and they need to feel secure in their identity as well as materially, you know, especially for men, it's incredibly important that they should be able to provide for their families and to feel that they're contributing in that way. And the current global market, which is marginalizing the 99%, is creating an absolutely clear and dramatic increase in violence, abuse of women, abuse of children, particularly from men who are feeling so frustrated because they're being robbed of their identity, robbed of their livelihood, and across the board one sees this increase. So we mustn't lose sight of this, that we're talking about this economic shift away from a few banks and corporations that are making it illegal for farmers to grow their own seeds, who want to patent them and push them on them and make sure that they put in a terminator gene so the seeds can't even be replicated. That is what we're talking about. That is a very, very clear need to transition. And in Costa Rica, what we were trying to say earlier is that when you have established this relationship, where in Costa Rica there is less money and more poverty, it's going across this global divide of currency speculation and manipulation. It's going to be very difficult for you to guarantee that your Nicaraguan coffee bought here hasn't gone through a system that's going to make them worse off. I mean, one of the ways that I've tried to lobby the fair trade movement is both with the ecological issues. They have not paid attention to the long transport miles, have only thought of how can we try to bring some money in there, and they haven't thought enough about the vagaries of the financial speculation and the change in value of currency and the glut in the market that has led to so many small producers only producing coffee, only producing cocoa, suddenly getting a tenth of what they were getting before. This is why we have a worldwide movement that is the biggest social movement in the world, called Via Campesina. Please remember that name. The biggest social movement in the world, Via Campesina, 200 million small farmers who are saying, please, 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 let us grow food for ourselves. They are for food sovereignty. And I want to thank Michael Croft, who's here in the audience. Put up your hand so people can see you, for helping to start a food sovereignty alliance in Australia.
Okay, thank you.
I try to advocate a two-track position and really would encourage many people to try to practice that. And on the one hand, we need urgently to raise awareness about the tsunami of interlinked capital and corporations that are getting a bigger and bigger energy appetite, a bigger and bigger appetite for minerals and resources. Winona, I think, spoke a bit about it. She could tell you more. The mega industrialization just rapidly eating up our planet. We need to raise awareness about that. And the wonderful thing about localization is that we have practical, grounded evidence that when it comes to food production and every other kind of production, we could dramatically reduce our energy need and generally our resource consumption by diversifying and localizing. So I think Mick may not have heard the arguments about the fact that small-scale diversified farming is actually much more productive per unit of land and water than big monocultures. So we have the evidence. We can show that there is another way, another type of banking, another type of farming. We have a paradigm that could, above all, build up that huge choir. So I'm very keen on trying to get that vision out as globally as possible, as quickly as possible. And so I'm very keen on the books and the films, using the internet, using our sources of all forms of communication and information. And part of what we're then demonstrating is also the real experiential, grandmother-based, relational, more holistic wisdom that we need to regain. But let's get the message out far and wide as part of the education. Thank you.
Okay. But Michael Shuman, Manish Jain, Adebayo Clement and Helena Norberg-Hodge, could you thank our panel, please? Thank you all to you too.